but first I would like to attest to the speaking abilities of Cindy B. She's a wonderful speaker, and in fact, when she spoke at the Georgia Beekeepers Association fall meeting last year, she gave a very inspirational talk and asked the question of the group, what will you do with this life you've been given? And I knew exactly what my answer was, and so what I piped up and said that maybe in 50 years after I'm gone, beekeepers will be able to say to each other, we used to have a horrible summer dearth, but thanks to the actions of beekeepers decades ago, we no longer have one. So that's a good segue right into my, okay, can you all see my screen and see the presentation? Yes, good. Okay, so again, my name is Jimmy Gatt. I'm a Georgia journeyman beekeeper. I'm the vice president of the Metro Atlanta Beekeepers Association, and I'm also a Trees Atlanta certified tree keeper. I'm going to be talking today about bees, trees, and nectar plants. So just a little note about these so-called Latin names. Latin names for plants aren't actually Latin. They're oftentimes Greek. So for instance, rhododendron is Greek for rose tree. So instead of calling them Latin names, I'll call them the scientific name or the binomial. And the reason why they're important is because scientific names uniquely identify plants. And the scientific name is the genus and the species. It'll be written in italics and we'll capitalize the genus. For instance, Liriodendron tulipifera. That is, of course, Tulip Poplar. It's the state tree of Tennessee. And sometimes I might talk about just a bunch of species in a genus. And so I'll write the genus and then abbreviate that with SPP. For instance, Pinus species, which is to say pine trees. And that sadly is the state tree of North Carolina. And pine trees are pretty much worthless to honeybees, but let's move on. So I live in Metro Atlanta, and let's compare these two regions. This is Metro Atlanta. It's called the city in the forest, and that's because Metro Atlanta has the densest tree canopy of any city in the United States. And Western North Carolina, I like to call this the most beautiful place on earth. And what do these two regions have in common? Well, trees, of course. And just doing a photograph of Burnsville, which is where y'all's club meet, is what I notice all around you. Trees, 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 trees. And over here, there's some more trees. And down here, there's some more trees. There's trees everywhere. This is going to be an easy conversation because all of you are very familiar and probably in love with the trees that are around you. But why are trees important for beekeepers? Well, what do bees eat? They eat nectar, and that's going to provide their carbohydrates for the energy. And they dehydrate the nectar into honey to store later for us. And they eat pollen, which is going to provide the fat and especially the protein that bees need, because bees are vegetarian, they get their protein from pollen. And 1 pound of pollen will be transformed into 3,500 honeybees, and I think that's amazing. And nectar and pollen come from, of course, flowers. So what do we call these plants? We call them forbs. And I assure you this is an English word. A forb means a small herbaceous plant that is not grass. Well, what is a flower anyway? Well, if we take a look at this diagram of a plant, we can see the roots at the bottom and the stems and the leaves in the middle. And at the top, you can see there's the reproductive part, and we call that reproductive organ the flower. Because after all, trees have flowers, shrubs have flowers, grasses have flowers, vines have flowers, and forbs also have flowers. So what do we call these plants? We call them forbs. And what kind of flowers do honeybees prefer? And now you understand why I had to go through that exercise, because if I just asked this question at the beginning, people are confused what I mean by flower. So here's a field of forbs. This is, of course, clover, and clover is a very important bee plant. It grows extensively in the northern states and produces just beaucoup of clover honey. And you can see why, because this field is just covered in all of these flowers all over these forbs. Now I'll show you one plant. This, of course, is a tree, and there's probably 150,000 flowers on this one plant. And the flowers are not merely hugging the ground, they're actually growing up into the air where the bees fly and filling the space. This is why I like to call a tree a meadow in the sky. And it's also why bees actually get the majority of their nectar and pollen from trees, not from forbs. So why has honeybee forage gotten worse in the past 60 or 70 years? That's actually a separate conversation I can go into, but I'll just kind of touch on it right now. Let's take a look at this bee foraging in this flower. And you'll notice down here in the bottom of the flower is these little organs. It's called the nectaries. And the nectary is the organ of the plant that actually produces nectar. And most nectaries are actually inside the flower, though there are some plants that actually have what they call extrafloral nectaries. Cotton is one of them, where the nectary is on the stem as well as in the flower. But in most cases, it's actually in the flower, and in most cases at the bottom. And that's because it's enticing the bee to crawl way down deep into the flower and get to the nectary. And in doing so, it will get pollen all over her body and then transfer that pollen to another plant. Well, the nursery trade has cultivated prettier flowers. This is a rose. And what is this? This is also a rose. Though if you had said it was a blackberry, I'd said it's a very good guess. And this is what roses used to look like. On the right is they had 5 petals, and they had exposed stamens and pistils, and they had exposed nectaries, and bees could actually get to the nectary. But that was too boring for us. So we cultivated roses with more petals, and now the bees cannot actually get to the nectaries anymore. We also cultivated plants that have longer blooming cycles. And the #1 candidate, in my opinion, is Crepe Myrtle. We have gazillions of them in Atlanta because they are the perfect city tree. And what consumers wanted was plants that would bloom longer. And so what they did was they bred these plants to not give any nectar. And that is why you will see blooming crepe myrtles all over Atlanta in July and not a single bee on them, because they have nothing to give the bees. And of course, we have America's #1 cultivated crop. No, it's not corn or wheat or soy. It's turf grass, lawns. We have more turf grass in America than we do corn, wheat, and soy combined. This looks pretty to us Americans for some reason. We see those pretty lines, but to bees, it looks like this, because it is literally a food desert for them. At best, it looks like this, and at worst, it looks like this. Not just a desert, but a poison desert. So let's just say I don't like lawns very much and leave it at that. So what can we do about this? Well, let's take a few steps back and talk about honeybee foraging behavior. Honeybees are mostly going to forage within 2 miles of the hive, and they can go as far as 5 or 6 miles, but they're going to dramatically lose their effectiveness once they get outside of 2 miles. And honeybees are opportunists. What this means is that they are going to ignore low profit sources of nectar in favor of high profit sources of nectar. And honeybees are going to bombard a huge flower source and forage from the same type of flower over and over and over again. And they will continue to forage from that same source until it is used up. This is called flower constancy, which is exhibited by honeybees, bumblebees, and some kinds of butterflies. So if you go to a buffet and you have the mind of a honeybee, you're not going to go to the salad bar and just start picking from lots and lots of different types of foods. You're not going to do that if you got the mind of a honeybee. You're going to go for the crab leg buffet, and you're going to go back to that crab leg buffet and keep eating those crab legs over and over until all those crab legs are gone. Now, does this look like anything I've shown you before? This is the other reason why trees are so important for honeybees, because they can provide in a single plant flower constancy. And this is what a bee-friendly tree looks like, is when it is providing nectar and blooming all over the tree, the honeybees are going to be just all over it. And there have been people who have been freaked out by this because they'll walk up to a tree and they'll hear it humming from the thousands of honeybees that are all over it, going absolutely nuts. Some of you might know what tree this is. I'll talk about it later, that's for sure. So here is a diagram I saw that was published quite some time ago. Oh, I will admit Rick Hardy. And it shows some of the plants that are blooming in Western North Carolina. And of course, sourwood is there, and it's very important. And I know that it's not really going to be accurate for all beekeepers in your region because of the number of microclimates you have. You know, someone living in the bottom of a holler is going to have a very different experience from someone who's living at the top of the mountain that's right next to that holler. So I'm going to try and give you ideas of things that can bloom in your regions, but there's no way I can answer all of these questions with 100% certainty. So trees for spring, and these are the ones that I would very highly recommend for beekeepers in your region, just because I'm aware that early spring is a high risk of starvation. We're going to go from the ones that bloom from the earliest to the ones that bloom latest in spring. So first we'll start off with silver maple. This is Acer saccharinum, and this is one of the earliest blooming maple trees that we will see in Western North Carolina. We don't have this tree in Georgia, but y'all do up there. It's going to be followed by red maple, Acer rubrum. And it's impossible to find a picture of a red maple tree that's not in fall foliage, just because it is so spectacular in fall. This is the earliest tree that blooms for us. It's actually blooming for us right now. And I should have also included sugar maple, which will probably bloom a little bit later than red maple. But these maples provide nectar and pollen. And of course, the pollen is very important for the bees during the very early spring, because that's of course when the bees are doing their buildup to try and build that huge forager force. Next, I'd like to mention redbud. This is Cercis canadensis. And this is an incredibly beautiful tree when it's in bloom with these purple pink blossoms. And the photo on the right is a photo that I took when I was vacationing in Italy a couple of years ago. Redbud, of course, is an exotic tree in Italy, but it's native here. And the honeybees love it over there, just like they do over here. Apple is definitely worth mentioning. And apple trees, oh, I've got to close this window. I can smell my neighbor smoking. Apple trees are fantastic, and apple trees, especially crabapple trees, are great because crab apples will feed the wildlife, and you're not going to be so worried about the apple tree getting sick or not producing. Instead, you can feed the wildlife. Next, of course, is black locust, and many of you are probably quite familiar with this tree. It does not grow quite nearly as readily down here. There's lots of people who despise this tree because of its suckering nature. I love this tree. It's going to have these cascading white flowers, super fragrant. I love the honey from it as well. Wonderful tree. And then tulip poplar, which is one of the largest sources of nectar in both of our regions. This tree grows like a weed on my property. I'm blown away by anyone who tries to sell this tree in my region. It's going to have these tulip-like flowers that open up. In fact, that's what tulipifera means. But the scientific name, Liriodendron tulipifera, that means the lily tree with the tulip flowers. This tree is not a poplar, it is not a lily, and it's not a tulip. This is actually a magnolia. And you can see this honeybee is landed on the sepal of this plant and is just lapping at the nectar that is pooling at the bottom of this flower. And this is a problem because when the tulip poplar flower opens, that's when it's going to give all its nectar right then. And if it rains right after it opens, it will wash the nectar out. I have heard that tulip poplar trees will actually bloom from the top to the bottom, so it's not like they're all going to open at once. They're very easy to identify. The leaf looks like this. It looks kind of like a chubby maple leaf. So now we'll go into summer, and summer is when your hives are the most populous. In my region, we have a horrible dearth in the summer. In your region, especially in Western North Carolina, you have sourwood, and I'm so envious. We have many Atlanta beekeepers who will take their hives up to North Georgia for the sourwood bloom, which happens in June in our region. The first one I have to mention has to be basswood. This is the queen of the honey trees. It's a huge tree. It's going to get to 80 to 100 feet tall, and it's got flowers that will hang and open downwards, so it doesn't actually get washed out when it rains. This tree generally gives honey 2 or 3 years out of every 5. Some years it's going to give honey, some not. This tree is also called linden or a lime tree. The next one I'll talk about is buttonbush. This is Cephalanthus occidentalis, and this tree absolutely loves wet feet. So if you've got a stream or a riverbed or just a low part in your property, you can grow this plant. It has got these fantastic looking spiky flowers that are going to be covered with bees and butterflies. And then it's going to give way to these attractive red fruits that will feed wildlife. The next tree I'll talk about is Devil's Walking Stick. This is Aurelia spinosa. It grows to about 20 feet tall and then is just going to explode in this huge like fireworks display of these white flowers that are going to be just absolutely covered in your bees. Those will eventually turn into these dark purple fruits that will feed wildlife. The reason why this tree is called Devil's Walking Stick is because the trunk looks like this. It's rather intimidating. If you're a tree hugger, this is not the tree you're hugging. This is a tree that I like to recommend as a barrier plant. So if you've got teenagers cutting through your property, you can plant some of this. It will colonize that region. Native Americans actually used this tree to protect their crops from wildlife. Next, I'm going to talk about sumac. And if you immediately thought about poison sumac, then try and clear your mind from that horrible tree. It grows in swamps. You're probably never, ever going to see it, unlike poison ivy, which grows everywhere and you probably will see. I'm going to be talking about the kinds of sumac that I love. So the first one is going to be Staghorn Sumac, and this one is called Staghorn Sumac because it has furry, fuzzy stems, kind of like a stag's horn. The next one will be Smooth Sumac, and it is easy to differentiate from Staghorn Sumac because, well, its stems are smooth. And the last one will be Winged Sumac, and this is the tree that I showed you in that video. This is my favorite sumac. I love sumac. It's tolerant of clay soil, it's tolerant of sandy soil, it's tolerant of acidic soil, it's tolerant of alkaline soil, it's tolerant of drought, it's colonizing, it's beautiful, it's tropical looking, it makes fantastic honey. And my favorite, the dried berries make awesome smoker fuel. So the reason why we see sumac growing on roadsides is because people kind of view it as a weed tree, and I think that's terrible because this is one of the best things that we can be planting for our honeybees. And of course, by all means, please plant more sourwood. Y'all can grow it. It grows in my region too, but it actually does not give any nectar. But it is nectivorous in your region, and sourwood honey is top of the line. So by all means, plant more sourwood trees. So I'll talk a bit about some of my favorite shrubs. The first one would have to be summer sweet. This is Clethra alnifolia. I've heard this described by one grower as a thug in the garden, and that is a very large positive for me because this plant will colonize and start growing more of them, and that just means more food for bees. I like the idea of these things growing on long after I'm gone. It's a living legacy that I give to our bees. Summer sweet is going to be pink. This is the Ruby Spice cultivar. It'll have white flowers and it's very, very fragrant. It is absolutely not drought tolerant. You've got to make sure to keep this one watered. The next one I'll talk about is coralberry. And Symphoricarpos orbiculatus has inconspicuous flowers that will be underneath the leaves. They kind of look like blueberry flowers. And those will turn into these beautiful purplish red berries that will feed wildlife in the winter. So if you have some American holly bushes and some coralberry bushes, you can trim those and turn those into a winter arrangement, and it's going to be really pretty. So next we'll talk about shrubby St. John's wort, Hypericum prolificum. There are several different species of St. John's wort. This one, of course, grows in kind of a shrubby habit, and it is just going to explode with these golden flowers all over it. Prolificum refers to the fact that this flower is almost 100% stamens, and that's just really amazing. And last, I'll talk about New Jersey tea. This is a smaller shrub. It's going to be maybe about 3 to 4 feet tall, but holy cow, look at those flowers. It's just these gorgeous white columns of flowers. This tree will grow a deep taproot. Sorry, this shrub, not a tree. The reason why it's called New Jersey tea is because the colonists in New England actually used the leaves of this plant as a tea substitute. I've never had it, but I have talked to people who have had it and they say it's pretty good. And so now we'll talk about my favorite forbs. Is just keep in mind that if you want to plant these as a beekeeper, you've got to plant them in a really big area, like 3 foot by 3 foot of all the same plant. Otherwise, your bees are just going to ignore them. There's going to be more profitable, buffets of crab legs somewhere else. So the first one is Anise Hyssop. Agastache Funiculum is this forb is amazing. It's probably the biggest bang for the buck you can get forb wise. It's going to be just covered with pollinators, and in my region, it's going to bloom from July all the way until frost in your region. Absolutely fantastic. You can see this one's covered with bees and butterflies. The next one I'd have to recommend is milkweed, and I definitely urge you to make sure you buy the native versions of milkweed. Asclepias tuberosum, Asclepias syriaca. Your bees will absolutely love this plant. The butterflies will absolutely love this plant. In fact, this is a monarch butterfly, and that's why this plant is important, because it is the host plant for the monarch butterfly, and this is what the larva of the monarch butterfly looks like. And if you thought bees were in trouble, butterflies are in dire shape. So if you can plant more host plants for butterflies, you would be doing them great favors. And the last one I'll talk about is clustered mountain mint. This is a nice large cluster of these forbs, but of course I'm looking at this land and I'm thinking, can't you plant some basswood trees there? There's a lot of grass there that deserves to die, but this plant is called clustered mountain mint because of its clustering habit. And I've heard it, oops, let me go back. I thought I had another slide there, but I don't. I've heard one grower call this a pollinator airport just because of the number of bees and wasps and butterflies on it. All right, a special tree for winter. Maybe you've seen this tree before. This is witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana. If you want to plant this tree, make sure you look at the scientific name, because there are other plants called witch hazel that are not this plant. What's fascinating about this plant is that it will bloom even into November. And so even when it gets, on slightly warmer days, is your bees can actually get some very late season forage, and honeybees are pretty much the only things that are going to be flying at the time that this plant is in bloom. So let's talk about a few trees that you probably have growing in your region that I don't suggest you plant. The first one would be golden rain tree, Colorataria peniculata. This tree is native to Taiwan. This tree is invasive and is crowding out our native trees. The next one would be a mimosa. And there are multiple species of mimosa, and this one is the most common. This tree is also invasive, and it is native to China. And the last one would be tree of heaven. It has leaves that look like sumac. It's oftentimes confused for sumac, but tree of heaven's a common name, and so I can use whatever common name I want. I'm going to call it tree of hell. Ailanthus altissima. This tree is also from China, and if you're familiar with this book, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, that tree is a tree of hell. And the reason why it's called that, just because it grows everywhere, it is extremely hard to kill, and all of those seeds that you see growing out of it have a 99% germination rate. So this tree is spreading everywhere. It's not sumac if you can take the leaf and break it and smell it. And if it smells like rotten peanut butter, it's tree of hell. In fact, one of the common names for this plant is stinking sumac. The toughest conversation I have is when I try and tell a beekeeper to give up a plant that is invasive, but that they see that their bees are working. A plant like leatherleaf Mahonia baeyi, is a very common landscape plant that is invasive and spreading everywhere in our forests right now. And oftentimes when I tell beekeepers, please kill that invasive plant, they'll tell me, well, I can just cut the berries off. And invasive plants are destroying our ecosystem. They are killing butterflies and native bees and all the life up the food chain. So praising invasive plants as good for bees is a great way to destroy the public goodwill that we have. because right now there are already people calling honeybees an invasive species. And this is specifically why Kristen Trainer started the magazine 2 Million Blossoms, was to try and bridge that gap between people who are advocating for native bees and our beekeepers, is that we should all be working together to restore our ecosystem. So about that goodwill, beekeeping is a social superpower. I'm going to say something really controversial right now. Colony collapse disorder was the best thing to ever happen to beekeeping. And why do I say that? Because it dramatically raised the public awareness and interest in honeybees. So because of that, you have the coolest hobby in the world right now, and everyone knows it. And that's why when people find out you're a beekeeper, they're going to ask you, what can I do to help the bees? And you will have their full undivided attention. Now tell me, what other hobby gives you this kind of social power? And what will you do with it? So how to use this social superpower? When someone asks you, what can I do to help the bees? You tell them this: plant trees that give nectar, and plant trees that give nectar in the time that we need it. Plant shrubs that give nectar in the spaces where the trees won't fit. You know, don't plant a basswood tree under power lines. It's a bad idea. And then plant forbs that give nectar in huge buffet-like numbers in at least a 3-foot by 3-foot area of all the same plant. And who to talk to? Gardeners, because gardeners right now are very interested in planting for pollinators. I've talked to so many of them who are chomping at the bit. And unlike beekeepers who are worried about splitting and treating and selling honey and marketing honey and have all these competing priorities, gardeners are worried about what's the next cool plant I'm going to plant. And I want to be the one to tell them what to plant. So why did I focus on these trees in particular? All of the trees and all of the shrubs and forbs that I've highlighted in this talk are native and also likely to grow in Western North Carolina. You're going to have to do more research to decide if they're going to thrive in your microclimate. I can't attest to that specifically. And beekeepers need to talk to each other about what grows well and what does well and what they see their bees working. A question I often get is, where do I buy these trees? What you're going to have to do is search the web and find local nurseries that are selling them, and make sure that you search with the scientific name, not the common name, because lots of things share common names. I don't recommend that you try to find these plants at your big box nursery store, because those plants are going to be selling what the nursery trade has been selling for the last 100 years. So why trees? Well, this is Wangari Maathai, and she's my hero. Trees are a keystone species, and they're the best way to restore the habitat and the food to our native species and to our bees. Wangari Maathai is my hero because she founded the Green Belt movement in Kenya. And she and her volunteers planted 56 million trees in Kenya with the Green Belt movement. And what I think about is, if just 10% of those trees were basswood trees, then that would be like planting 2.5 million acres of clover. And her organization was all bottom-up power, mostly volunteers and mostly women. And in doing this, she transformed Kenyan society, and she was the first African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. So this is what inspires me to do what I do, is I talk to beekeepers and I talk to gardeners. And what I can tell you is the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is right now. And thank you. I will stop screen sharing and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Jimmy, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Anybody have questions? I'm sure Jimmy would love to answer them.
I love talking to
yourself.
I love the question and answer because I oftentimes get questions about, well, what about this plant? And that's how I learn about new plants.
Cyrus is. So Jimmy, how long does it take if I planted a basswood tree in my backyard today? How long would it take for that tree to become useful to bees?
I have heard some claims that it will take 7 to 11 years for that tree to start flowering, but the basswood tree I planted in my front yard bloomed on the 2nd year. And in fact,
wow.
I even got a fruit from it. That's a basswood fruit, it's a seed. And I was able to get one of these, and I'm going to try and germinate it.
Very cool.
So Jimmy, I got to hear you give your talk on the podcast that Lee Knott has, Five Apple Farms. And one of the books that you mentioned is a book that I love, and that's Shannon Trimboli's book of plants that bees use in the Ohio Valley region, I think is what it's called. Do you want to talk a little bit about that book? It has, I mean, it's got pretty much every plant you just talked about, but it also talks about, you know, which ones are invasive, which ones are native.
Absolutely. Yes, this is a fantastic book. I'm going to put it into the chat right now. So for those of you who might be interested, and I recommend this to all beekeepers who live in the eastern part of the United States. It details every good plant, as in trees, shrubs, vines, and forbs that's going to grow in the different seasons and where they're most popular in certain regions. And Shannon Trimboli said, I wrote this book because I wanted this book and no one had written it. And so I decided to write it. She is a great speaker, a great beekeeper, super knowledgeable, and someone I like to call a friend. So highly recommended. From the chat, the question is best tree? Best in terms of what? If I were to recommend a single tree to a person and just they could only plant one tree, I would say make it winged sumac. If they have a lot of wide open space, then I would say please plant a linden tree. If they want to keep their neighbors out, I'd say plant devil's walking stick. If they want fruit, I would say plant apple trees. I've heard nasty things about cherry trees. I've heard that, I mean, they are nectivorous, but I've heard one Welsh honey judge say that cherry trees give a really nasty tasting honey. If anybody can confirm that in this group, I'd like to know. No? Okay. Other questions?
Well, I'm trying to think of my question, but my sister in Bristol had planted a tree from heaven in her yard, and it started growing up under her house and into the flooring of her house. It was that bad. But as far as the winged sumac goes, is that the sumac that you can put in your smoker and it helps kill or at least knock out the mites?
I've seen no scientific study done on whether sumac smoke will have a helpful effect on varroa mites. I'm highly skeptical that it would be helpful in that regard.
Okay.
In terms of smoker fuel, I think the fruit of any of the sumac trees I mentioned would work quite well.
And that would be the leaves, the stems, or just what would it be?
The berries.
The berries, just the berries?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Are there, let's say, nurseries in the area that would, let's say if a group of us just got together and bought 25, 30 trees, would they wholesale to a group, do you think?
Yes, I think that is possible. I've looked at some wholesale companies. And many of them want larger orders than that. I know I have talked to more than one bee club in Georgia who have made an order like that. I can possibly reach out to them and find out who they ordered from if y'all might be interested in that.
I might add that Carolina Native Nursery here, just on the other side of Burnsville, has a very nice selection. I don't know if they would do wholesale, but their prices are reasonable. And I've purchased plants from them in the past. Matter of fact, I have a nice little sort of hedgerow of Redbud from them. So, and they're very knowledgeable of what's, what grows in what microclimates in the area as well.
Can I see a show of hands from the group if you have a reliable sourwood harvest? Raise your hand if you get sourwood. 1. Okay, wow. I was expecting there to be a lot more. And
we got wiped out last year with the rain. It just murdered the sourwood. It just,
really?
The rain just took care of all that. We had lots of.
Oh, that's so sad.
It was heartbreaking.
I think the operative word there was reliable. Sourwood up here is not reliable. It's great or it's not.
I see. It kind of sounds like basswood in that regard. I think sumac would probably be a lot more reliable.
So how tall does the sumac get?
It depends on the species. If it is thriving, it's reasonable for it to get about maybe 15 feet tall and just as wide. It's going to have a shrubby habit, but there are some that can get even taller, up to 20 feet. But it all depends on how it's allowed to grow. And sadly, I don't see a lot of really big sumac because it's growing in disturbed areas, and then those areas just get cleared and they put up another vape store or whatever.
Yeah. Sarcasm.
So we have 4. I was just thinking, like, you're talking about invasive plants that are bee friendly, but probably shouldn't have. Up here, and I'm going to apologize because I don't know the scientific names of these, but we have Japanese knotweed.
Oh, yes.
Which is horribly prolific. I guess it's a polygonia of some sort. But when it blooms, the bees are all over it. And sometimes it blooms when we have a dearth. And so it's kind of like good to have. Butterfly bush, which I have seen now growing along the edges of creeks and rivers where the seeds have been picked up and carried downstream. Bradford Pear. We don't have much of that here in the mountains, but last time I flew out of Charlotte, it was spring, and I looked out the window and I could see all the Bradford pears blooming in the woods. And then, of course, multiflora rose, which was brought here by our lovely Department of Transportation as a erosion control. The bees love it. It is a wild rose, but it is so invasive that once it gets hold, you can't even crawl through it.
Yes, Bradford Pear has an interesting story. It was the favorite tree for landscapers for many years because it was reliably pretty. And so you will find this everywhere in schools and parking lots all throughout Atlanta. I despise this tree. And what happened is they came up with a new cultivar, and then they crossbred, and now they were no longer sterile trees, and that's how they became invasive trees. The state flower of Georgia is the Cherokee rose, Rosa levigata, which is an invasive plant from China. And I don't know about y'all, but I think it's adding insult to injury that we decided to name this invasive Chinese weed after the Cherokee.
Let's sign a petition.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned so many plants from China that are invasive. I mean, it's so apropos today.
It's fascinating. Do you know why? if you take the United States and were to translate it at the same latitude across the world, then the southeast, where we all live, would be right smack in the southeast of China. They're right at the same latitude. And so for every version of native plant that we have, they have the same kind of their own version. Like we have magnolias and they have magnolias, and we have cherries and they have cherries, and we have honeysuckle and they have honeysuckle. And so those plants are all just perfectly suited for our climate with none of the predators. And we actually have some of our plants that are invasive in China now. It's just not nearly as bad because our nursery trade has been going on for a lot longer, and the public's desire for new and exciting plants, well, those are going to come from the place where they would grow best in our environment, and that happened to be China.
I had a surprise come on when I stopped bush hogging my fields. Wing stem plant comes up. Every pollinator out there will be on it, including the honeybees.
I have to look that up. I'm not sure what that is.
It's in the sunflower family.
It's a square tubular plant, and on each corner of it looks like it has a wing all the way up the length of it. And it'll grow anywhere from about 2 to about 6, 7 foot tall, and has small yellow flowers on the top. I think there's about 3 or 4 different varieties out here.
Take a look at that.
I don't know the scientific name.
Take a look at the link I just posted in chat and tell me if you think that's it.
I'm not seeing what you're trying to show me.
Oh, in the chat.
That looks like it to me.
Yeah, I posted a second link, but it looks like the first one might be the wingstem we're talking about. Verbicina alternifolia. And if so, that's a native plant. Looks like it's, yep, it's an aster. I've heard some people call asters like this DYFs, which stands for damn yellow flowers. I understand that y'all have an Astro Bloom in the fall, and that's basically the last hurrah for nectar in your region. Is that true?
Yes, it comes on right after or right near the end of the goldenrod. And if it's a good aster flow, then that may just get us through winter.
Yes, Dr. Clarence Colson has stated that aster honey is very likely to crystallize. I don't know how true that is. The asters in question are in the Symphyotrichum genus. Aster is the largest plant family. There's hundreds of thousands of species in that family. And so when people talk about asters, it's always a little bit confusing to me, but it's Symphyotrichum. Other questions?
Anybody have other questions? That's a cute puppy.
Oh, thank you. His name is Gizmo. He was actually stung by one of my honeybees and got anaphylaxis and almost died. So that is a part of my story and as being a beekeeper, and it usually works its way into my talk about safety in the bee yard.
Any other questions? Well, thank you all for joining us, and especially thank you, Jimmy, because that was a fascinating presentation, and I'm going to go to Carolina Native Nursery next week and see what I can find.
Thank you, Jim.
All right. Well, thank you all very, very much, and this was a wonderful experience, and go plant some trees.